Welcome everyone to this presentation about the sedimentology stratigraphy of the Cenomanian Buda Limestone in west central Texas, revisiting its controversial depositional setting. This research is part of my PhD project at the University of Saskatchewan under the supervision of Dr. Luis Butua and Dr. Gabriela Mangano, and also with the collaboration of some other colleagues from the Texas A&M University. The outline of this presentation is the following. I'm going to start with a brief introduction about the Buda Limestone, followed by the geological framework and study area, lithostratigraphy and contacts, sedimentary facies, depositional setting, sequence stratigraphy and depositional controls, and a final summary of this research. The Buda Limestone is a lower Cenomanian, highly bioturbated shock that crops out in Texas, northern Mexico, and eastern New Mexico. In south-central Texas, this formation occurs as continuous strata in the subsurface. This formation was firstly described by Robert Hill, which is considered the father of Texas geology, during his expedition in 1889, where he was studying invertebrate fossils in the Cretaceous of Texas. Dr. Hill called this formation as Buda Limestone. However, that name was already occupied by another formation in Indiana. Therefore, this formation was renamed as Buda Limestone, based on the town of Buda in Texas, where this formation is outcropping. The name of this town itself derived from the Spanish word viuda, that means widow. The type section of this formation is located in the Shoal Creek in Austin, Texas. The West Texas reference section is located in the southern Quitman Mountains, approximately 150 kilometers southeast of the El Paso-Ciudad Juarez border. The Buda Limestone is up to 105 meters thick, and its thickest section is located in the southern Quitman Mountains. The matrix porosity is below 5%, and the Buda Limestone is a naturally fractured reservoir that has been producing hydrocarbons since 1920s. Why is it important to study the Buda Limestone? Well, the study of the sedimentology and stratigraphy of the Buda Limestone will help to understand the main depositional controls on the coccolith-rich Cenomanian sequences of the Gulf Coast Basin, and also another Cenomanian sequences around the globe in general. The Buda Limestone is a key stratigraphic marker of the Texas Gulf Coast Basin that represents the final flooding of the Comanche Shelf by shallow seas at the end of the Comanche epoch. The Buda Limestone, as I said before, is an active oil and gas reservoir in several fields along Texas. But why we are interested in particular in the sedimentology and stratigraphy of this formation? Well, very little research has examined in detail the sedimentology and stratigraphy of this unit. A regional sequence stratigraphic correlation of the Buda Limestone is missing, and there are controversies about the depositional setting and the character of the stratigraphic boundaries of this unit. For example, in terms of the depositional environment, the western Texas Buda Limestone was interpreted either as a deep subtidal carbonate or as an offshore carbonate deposit below the storm wave base. In central Texas, on the other hand, the Buda Limestone was considered either as a shallow subtidal carbonate or as a deep subtidal carbonate, but consistently interpreted as a shallower carbonate than its western counterpart. This controversial character of the Buda Limestone is probably related to the high degree of bioturbation in this unit that destroys most sedimentary fabric and complicates its interpretations. Moreover, the water circulation regime during the Buda Limestone deposition is also matter of debate. Some authors interpret a lagoonal Buda Limestone, whereas other authors propose a fully open marine shelf setting. Another evidence of the controversial character of this formation are the different interpretations of its stratigraphic contacts. The lower contact with the Del Rio Formation was interpreted either as a conformable or unconformable contact by some authors in both the West and Central Texas regions, whereas the upper contact with the Eagle Ford group is constantly interpreted as an unconformity, but some authors consider that this unconformity is submarine in character, and other authors consider a subaerial exposure of the Buda limestone before the onset of the Eagle Ford group. Now let's talk about the geological framework and the study area of this research. As you can see in this paleogeographic map of North America during the Lower Cenomanian, the time of deposition of the Buda limestone, the western interior seaway was disconnected from the Gulf of Mexico, thus having the Comanche Shelf, the place of deposition of the Buda limestone, isolated from the Maury Sea in the northern part of the continent. Now talking about the study area covered by this research, here in this Texas map, you can see that our studied section, the black squares, are located in the West and Central Texas regions, with most of them following this outcrop belt that goes from the yellow one that goes from northern Texas to far west Texas. These more detailed maps from these regions show the specific location of the different outcrops and cores. In West Texas, they are located in an area from Comstock to Dryden, whereas in Central Texas, they comprise the northern part of San Antonio to Austin region. In terms of stratigraphy, as you can see in this chronostratigraphic chart, the Buda limestone belongs to the uppermost portion of the Cretaceous Comanche series of Texas, and is overlaid by the Eagle Ford group in West Texas and the Eagle and Woodbine groups in Central Texas. The lower contact of this formation is with the Del Rio Formation and its lateral equivalents in the West and the Central Texas region. As you can see in the right side of this screen, the Buda limestone is internally subdivided in West Texas into three formal lithostratigraphic members that were defined by Richter and Robinson in the southern Quitman Mountains. These are the Lechuguilla member, the Red Light member, and the Love Station member. In Central Texas, on the contrary, this unit is informally subdivided into two members. These are the lower and the upper Buda. Here there are two pictures showing the appearance of the West Texas Buda members in the Del Rio area. As you can see, the Lechuguilla and the Love Station members are characterized by a massive limestone, whereas the Red Light member or middle Buda is characterized by a more nodular and weathering recessive limestone. All these members are delimited by fair ground or hard ground surfaces. For example, this picture is showing a thalassinoides fair ground suite developed in the uppermost Lechuguilla member in contact with the more nodular Red Light member. The contact is at the top of this rock hammer in the picture. We also did some XRD analysis of these units. As you can see, the Red Light member is composed of a dirtier or siliciclastic-richer limestone, whereas the carbonates from the other members, the Lechuguilla and the Love Station members, are a cleaner limestone. Now these pictures are showing the two informal lithostratigraphic members of the Buda limestone in the Central Texas region. As you can see, the lower Buda is more massive and less bioturbated, whereas the upper Buda is completely bioturbated. Also, as shown in the picture D, this one in the lower right side, the contact between these members is also characterized by a firm ground surface. In Central Texas, we also did some XRD analysis that shows that the lower Buda member, and particularly its uppermost part, it has higher concentrations of siliciclastic minerals and pyrite than the upper Buda member. But in general, The Central Texas Buda Limestone is cleaner than its western counterpart. This might be related to the presence of the San Marcos Arc and other paleo-structures in Central Texas that inhibited most terrestrial influence. Now talking about the stratigraphic contacts of the Buda Limestone, there in West Texas, as you can see in the left side picture, the contact with the lower contact of the Buda Limestone with the Del Rio Formation is an unconformity, and the lowermost Buda is characterized by extra class from the Del Rio Formation that are embedded in the matrix. These class are usually highly worn by gastrochenolitis and trypanitis, as you can see in this picture. Interestingly, in other areas, like in the Terre Arc, which is a paleo-high in West Texas, the Buda Limestone is directly in contact with the Georgetown Formation, and the Del Rio Formation is missing. The Del Rio Formation was probably eroded or not deposited in this area. Also, as you can see in the right side picture, the uppermost Georgetown Formation is characterized by a classic hard ground surface with abundant moles of bivalves and also gastrochenolitis. The upper contact of the Buda Limestone with the Eagle Ford group, on the other hand, is characterized by small cavities or depressions filled by Eagle Ford group sediments, as you can see in the picture in the left. This infilling material preserves the depositional texture or same lamination than the Eagle Ford group, therefore interpreted as karstic cavities that were present before the deposition of the Eagle Ford group. In other areas, these cavities are not present, but there is the development of a hard ground surface, as you can see in the picture on the right side. This red arrow is showing a gastrochenolitis boring that was developed in the uppermost Buda Limestone. In addition to the karstic cavities and hard grounds, in the Terre Arc region, the uppermost Buda Limestone is characterized by a paleosol. The picture in the left side is a core plug sample that we drilled in the outcrop and preserved the contact between the Buda Limestone and the Eagle Ford group. The picture in the right is a picture of a thin section that we did of this sample. As you can see, the Buda Limestone is characterized by caliche peloids and by microstalactite cement, probably related to the process of karstification. We consider that this paleosol is lower Cenomanian in age, since the Eagle Ford group in contact with the Buda Limestone is not affected by the pedogenesis. And this is a clear evidence of subaerial exposure of the Buda Limestone before the onset of the Eagle Ford group. Now let's talk about the sedimentary facies of the Buda Limestone in the study area. In the study area, we were able to recognize 9 main sedimentary facies, 5 in West Texas and 4 in Central Texas. All these facies are characterized by a coccolith-rich matrix. Coccolith are calcitic plates secreted by a phytoplankton called coccolithophore. In the right side picture, you can see a good example of very well preserved coccoliths within the carbonate-rich matrix of the Buda Limestone. And also, if you go to the lower part, to the lower picture, you can see the red arrow showing an euhedral coarse grain within this carbonate matrix. Now let's talk in detail about all these sedimentary facies. Let's start with this facies 1, which is an oyster-rich patchstone that was recognized in the Lechuguilla member of West Texas. This facies is characterized by abundant oysters, the ones shown by the green arrow, and Cribatina texana, the red arrow, which is an arenaceous foraminifera that is typical of brackish water environments. Based on this composition and considering the absence of stenoline marine fauna in these facies, we interpret these facies to be deposited in a brackish water semi-restricted lagoon. Facies 2 is also only present in the Lechuguilla member of West Texas. This facies is a green algae-rich wacky stone to patchstone that is characterized by abundant dasycladalian green algae, that one indicated by the red arrow. These dasycladalian green algae are typically deposited in very shallow water environments. Also, this facies has important concentrations of large-size bioclasts, as you can see the picture in the left side, and among other marine fauna. We interpret these facies to be deposited in a shallow subtidal lagoon with more marine influence than in the case of the facies 1. Facies 3, this one indicated by the blue arrow, is a clay and quartz-rich mudstone to wackeystone that is characterized by its weather-recessive profile, as you can see in the picture, and a relatively impoverished fauna, mostly composed of oysters and echinoderms. This facies is also limited to the West Texas outcrops, and particularly to the red light membrane. We interpret facies 3 to be deposited in a slightly restricted lagoonal setting during periods of relative carbonate starvation, as indicated by the high concentration of clays and quartz in these facies. Facies 4 is the most common sedimentary facies of the Buda Limestone in West Texas. This facies is a mudstone to a skeletal wackeystone, and based in different elements such as the depositional texture, bioturbation degree, and siliciclastic content, these facies can be subdivided into 3 subfacies. These are facies 4A, facies 4B, and facies 4C. Facies 4A and facies 4C are more massive and cleaner limestones. However, the difference between these two subfacies is the higher bioturbation intensity and the lower content of planktonic foraminifera in facies 4C. Facies 4B, as you can see in the picture in the left side, is a more nodular limestone and also is richer in quartz and clays. Also, as you can see in this picture, the facies 4B is also characterized by a higher abundance of siliceous sponges and pyrite. We interpret that the facies 4A and facies 4C to be deposited in a deep subtidal, nearly open marine lagoon, whereas the facies 4C was deposited during shallower water periods that promoted clay ponding and higher degree of water restriction, as indicated by the higher content of clay and pyrite in these subfacies. Facies 5, this graded to laminated wackeystone to packstone, was also only recognized in West Texas and is limited to the red light membrane. This facies consists of normally graded scours, as you can see in this facies 5A in the left side picture, or gutter casts, as you can see in this facies 5B in the right side picture, that are characterized by an erosive base and are followed by the deposition of either pseudo-parallel laminated beds or homology cross-stratified beds. This is an example of facies 5C. This is the pseudo-parallel laminated bed, or as you can see in the picture on the right side, this facies 5D is the homology cross-stratified bed. This facies 5 is interpreted as a gutter cast on proximal tempestites deposited in a deep subtidal lagoon. As you can see, there are distinctive features of this proximal tempestite as the channel erosive base, the limited horizontal and vertical extension, and also the normal grading among other features within these facies. The picture in the right side, as you can see, is a book example of a proximal tempestite that is formed from the base to top by an erosive base that is rich in bioclast. Also, there is the presence of a escape burrow, as you can see shown by this red arrow, and then it's followed by the deposition of a homology cross-stratified bed, which is the facies 5D, that is more bioturbated than the base of this tempestite. Facies 6 is a calcisphere rich skeletal wackeystone to packstone, with also high concentration of phagoselids, meteolites, and pyrite. This facies is typical of the lowermost Buda member in the central Texas area, and also it can be subdivided into 2 subfacies, subfacies 6A and subfacies 6B. The main difference between these subfacies is the higher content of oysters in facies 6A. As you can see in this following picture, This will be a Tetragryphea specimen of oyster in this facies 6A. This facies 6, in general, is considered to be deposited in a semi-restricted shallow subtidal lagoon with slightly hypersaline conditions. Now this facies 7 is also characteristic of the lower Buda member of central Texas, and it is composed of a wispy laminated mudstone to skeletal watstone, as you can see in the picture on the left side. In terms of fauna, this facies 7 is similar to facies 6. However, it is richer in pyrite, meteorites, the ones indicated by this green arrow, and also green algae. Based on the color, the composition, and bioturbation of these facies, it can be subdivided into 3 subfacies. These are the facies 7A, which is lighter color and more bioturbated, as you can see in the picture in the left side. Then we have the facies 7B, which is darker color and richer in pyrite and way less bioturbated. And then we have this facies 7C, that is similar to facies 7A but richer in green algae, as shown by this green arrow in the lower part of this picture. As in the case of facies 6, we interpret that facies 7 was deposited in a shallow subtidal semi-restricted lagoonal setting with slightly hypersaline conditions. However, we consider that facies 7 was deposited in a shallower and more restricted setting than facies 6 due to the higher concentration of pyrite and green algae in this facies 7. Facies 8 is an echinoderm-rich skeletal wackestone to patchstone. This is typical of the upper Buda member of central Texas. It is characterized by abundant green algae and also by a high bioturbation and the presence of some intraclass, as you can see this one indicated by the red arrow in the right side picture. This facies is interpreted to be deposited in a more marine and more oxygenated shallow subtidal setting, lagoonal setting, than the settings of deposition of facies 7 and facies 6. Then finally we have the facies 9, which is a non-skeletal grains-rich intraclastic wackestone to patchstone. This facies is characteristic of the upper Buda member in central Texas. It is completely bioturbated, as you can see in this picture, showing three-dimensional networks of thalassinoides. And also, if you go to the left side of this picture, as indicated by this red arrow, these facies preserve some relics of large cross-bedding. Based on the content of these non-skeletal grains in these facies, we can subdivide these facies into 3 subfacies. We have subfacies 9A, 9B, and 9C. Subfacies 9A is characterized by 15 to 25% of non-skeletal grains, which are mostly composed of peloids and rounded intraclass. Subfacies 9B has 25 to 50% of these non-skeletal grains, and they are mostly composed of well-rounded to spheric intraclass. And finally, this subfacies 9C is characterized by more than 50% of non-skeletal grains that are composed by well-rounded spheric intraclass, ooids, and also some aggregate grains. This facies 9 is interpreted to be deposited in an energetic, shallow subtidal, nearly open marine setting, with subfacies 9C representing the higher energy conditions. Based on the facies descriptions and the interpretations that we just discussed, we consider that the Buda limestone from West Texas was deposited in a lagoonal shelf setting with semi to nearly open marine conditions. And this graph that you can see here in this screen will be the depositional facies model of this area that has facies 1 and facies 4A as the bathymetric end members. We also consider that all these facies were deposited above the storm wave base, and the lagoonal circulation of this shelf was mainly controlled by the presence of the Stuart City Sligo Paleo Reef trend. The water depth in this area is considered to be below 40 meters. Why we consider this number? If you remember that we have a paleosol in Buda, as I showed you in the previous slides, and also that the maximum magnitude of sea level change during the Cenomanian, according to the literature, for example, Ray et al. 2019, is about 40 meters, so having a water depth higher than 40 meters is unlikely in this area. Likewise, in central Texas, we interpret as semi-restricted to nearly open marine lagoonal setting, but considering that this area was deposited in a shallower setting than its western counterpart. This area was probably in a higher setting or in a paleo-high because it was affected by the San Marcos Arc, which is a paleo-structure that is located in this central Texas region. In central Texas, in this area, we consider that the more restricted, the less bioturbated, and the pyrite-richer facies are the shallowest in character. In general, we interpret a partially restricted lagoonal shelf setting for the Buda limestone, and this lagoonal circulation was probably influenced by a low-gradient paleotopography and the occurrence of several positive relief paleostructures, as you can see in this picture. For example, the Lower Cretaceous Paleo-Reef Trend, the San Marcos Arc, and all these structures avoid a fully marine circulation of waters from the open sea to this Buda paleo-shelf. This interpretation agrees with the view of Young 1972, who considered the Buda limestone as a generalized lagoonal deposit in order to explain the occurrence of endemic ammonites in this formation. Now, talking about the sequence stratigraphic architecture of this Buda limestone, and based on our facies analysis, this will be the ideal parasequences of the Buda limestone in West Texas and in Central Texas. These parasequences are the basic blocks of the stratigraphic architecture of the Buda limestone, and they are vertically piled, forming the different system tracts and sequences of this formation. Based on our sequence stratigraphic analysis of the Buda limestone from West Texas is composed of two fourth-order high-frequency sequences, both comprising a transgressive system tract followed by a high-stand systems tract. The sequence 1 comprises the Lechuguilla member and the Red Light member, whereas the sequence 2 corresponds to the Love Station member. In Central Texas, like in the West Texas area, we have two fourth-order high-frequency sequences composed of a transgressive system tract followed by a high-stand system tract. But in this case, the sequence 1 corresponds to the informal Lower Buda member, and the sequence 2 corresponds to the also informal Upper Buda member. Based on the sequence stratigraphic correlation of the different system tracts that we identify in the West Texas area and the Central Texas area, we are correlating the informal Central Texas Lower Buda member with the Lechuguilla member and the Red Light member from West Texas. Likewise, we correlate the Central Texas Upper Buda member with the Love Station member in Western Texas. This correlation supports a coeval, shallower, and siliciclastic-richer setting during the deposition of the Western Red Light member and the uppermost Lower Buda member in Central Texas. Now, analyzing the possible controls on the deposition of these different depositional cycles, or in other words, the transition from this earlier more carbonatic or coccolith-richer Buda limestone to this siliciclastic-richer and less carbonatic succession that is represented, for example, by the transition from the Lechuguilla member to the Red Light member, and then the return of this Buda limestone to a more carbonatic and coccolith-richer Buda limestone that is represented by the Love Station member. Analyzing this transition, and also based on the system tracts that we identify, we were able to build this Buda limestone fourth-order relative sea level curve, as you can see in the left side, in this graph in the left side of the screen. This in order to compare its rising and falling trends with the one from the well-known eustatic sea level curves. As you can see, there is not a total agreement between all the eustatic curves. However, some of them have similar trends, and more importantly, there is a large positive covariance between the eustatic sea level curve of Gale et al. 2002 and the one of the Buda Limestone. This eustatic sea level curve of Gale et al. 2002 is considered to have the more extensive review of the Cenomanian stage. You can see that when you have rising eustatic sea levels in this eustatic curve, they are coupled with rising relative sea levels in the Buda paleo-shelf. Interestingly, high-stand system tracts facies in the Buda Limestone succession seem to be linked with sea level falls or still stands in most eustatic curves. In order to explain these coheval high-stand system tracts with eustatic sea level drops, we have to consider local subsidence rates outpacing these lower eustatic sea level rates. But more interesting is the fact that the eustatic sea level curve of Gale and the Buda Limestone relative sea level curve seem to be coupled with changes in the eccentricity and insolation rates in the planet, according to these astronomical solutions of Lascard et al. 2004 and 2011. For example, periods of eccentricity maxima and higher and more variable insolation seem to be correlated with periods of rising sea levels and more carbonatic production. Knowing that the Buda Limestone is mostly composed of coccolith, this could be showing an orbital forcing in the concentration of these particular organisms. On the other side, periods of eccentricity minima and lower and less variable insolation seem to be correlated with dropping sea levels and periods when the Buda Limestone became richer in siliciclastic material. Unfortunately, in the Buda Limestone, these marlstone and chalk couples that are used for these orbital forcing studies were destroyed by bioturbation. However, at the members scale, these correlations are supporting an orbital control on the Buda Limestone depositional cycles. Moreover, if we consider that the whole Buda Limestone was deposited in an age interval between 600 to 800,000 years, since to the age model of Minicini et al. 2018, and also considering the similar thickness of the Buda Limestone sequences, the sequence 1 and sequence 2, we could attribute these sequences to the long eccentricity cycle of the Earth, the approximately 400,000 years cycle. As a summary of this research, we have that the lower Cenomanian Buda Limestone was deposited in inner-neritic waters of a lagoonal shelf environment with variable water restriction. The central Texas Buda Limestone was deposited in shallower waters than its western counterpart. The Buda Limestone is subdivided into two four-order high-frequency sequences controlled by climate-driven eustatic sea level changes under possible astronomic control. The bounding stratigraphic contacts of the Buda Limestone are unconformable, and the Buda Limestone was subaerially exposed before the onset of the Eagle 4 group. If you want to check more about this study, you can go to this paper that we just published a few months ago on marine and petroleum geology, where we were discussing the different depositional controls and environments of the Buda Limestone, particularly in the West Texas area. Thank you so much for your attention.